Conservative estimates suggest that over 100,000 Christians are slaughtered around the world every year for their faith. And the deep state's fingerprints are all over it, especially when it comes to the hijacking of the U.S. government's foreign policy. Stay tuned and I'll tell you more. So Christians right now all across Afghanistan are being slaughtered. They're being butchered with $80 billion worth of American weapons left behind by deep state puppet Joe Biden, really by his handlers when he withdrew from there with his tail between his legs. Go back and watch last week's episode if you want to know what that was about. The Frontier Alliance International, a ministry, released a statement from the underground church in Afghanistan. They said the Taliban has a hit list of known Christians they are targeting to pursue and kill. The Daily Wire reported that Taliban terrorists are going through people's cell phones, and if they can find a Bible app on there that shows they're Christian, and then they are dealt with. The Christian nonprofit organization SAT7 in North America reported that Taliban are literally pulling people off of buses and public transportation and killing them if they are Christians. Radio host Glenn Beck, some of you guys might have heard of this. He actually set up the Nazarene Fund to try to extract thousands of people from Afghanistan, including Christians, mostly women and children. And incredibly, the U.S. State Department stood in the way of those flights to try to block them. Something very fishy is going on here, guys. And unfortunately, it's part of a much longer pattern. Actually, in an interview with radio host Todd Stearns, U.S. Congressman Mark Walker said that a Christian Afghan was skinned alive and hung on a pole by the Taliban. And I want to show you a quick little clip from an Afghan Christian.
شما جوری سلام باشید. ما امروز در افغانستان اولین روزی سیاه در زیر حکومت طالبان را شروع کردیم و نمی‌فهمیم که آینده از این مملکت، آینده از این ملک چه خواهد شد. واقعا قلب ما درد داره، واقعا احساسات ما روی کنترل نیست. میخواد که 20 سال روی مول زحمت کشیده شد. تمام دستاوردهای 20 ساله با در یک شب از بین رفت. فقط خدا میفهمد ما چقدر درد داریم، چقدر قلب من ناآرام است. ما یه اشوای گریه به بخاطر ترس نیست، بخاطر قلب درد گرفته که مملکت ما، مملکت زیبای ما به دست گروه وحشی افراطی یافتاده و تمام ارزش‌هایی که برای از مملکت بود از بین رفت. کل دنیا امروز ما رو تنها گذاشتن. همون دنیایی که میگم ما حامی پشتیبان شما هستیم، در بدترین شرایط، در سخت‌ترین شرایط مردم افغانستان رو تنها گذاشتن رفتن. و نمی‌فهمم که وضعیت چی میشه. آیا ما در دل حکومت طالبان چه قسم سپری بکنیم؟ امروز ویدیو رو برای شما دوست دارید ثبت کنم. در تاریخ میخوایم بماند. میخوایم بماند که دوستای شما، عزیزان شما در این راه امروز تنها و تنها در میدان باقی مانده. ما میدان رها نمیکنیم، هستیم، با قوت بیشتر مبارزه میکنیم، در کار خداوند ادامه میدیم. اما این رو بدانید اگر یک روزی که نبود دور هم بود دیگه ما بین شما نبودیم، یک حرفایی از قلب ما، از قلب ناگفته ما برای شما توقیف میکنم که چقدر این روز برای ما سخت تمام میشه. اگر کسی از ما فوقی ما، اگر فرزندهای ما، اولادهای ما فوقی ما، پای شما از شما است که تنهایشان نگذارید، احوالشان رو بگیرید، نگذارید تنها بمونید. ببخشید که احساساتی شده میخواد قلب مطلب دارم. این رو به عنوان یک یادگار برای تمام شما دوستان میفرستم. امیدوار هستم که جور و صحتمند باشه، در پناه خداوند، در پناه پدر آسمانی باشه. تشکر.
So the history of persecution in Afghanistan is long. It's nothing new, but it really intensified after the U.S. government, in particular, the deep state-controlled foreign policy arm of the U.S. government, unleashed the Taliban and the Mujahideen and the Al Qaeda and the Islamic fanatics with heavy American weaponry on the people of Afghanistan under the guise of fighting the Soviet Union. You can thank people like Zbigniew Brzezinski for that. Now, like in Iraq and many other places, the history of Christianity in Afghanistan goes back almost 2,000 years. According to various sources, the Apostle Paul was actually in what is today Afghanistan, preaching the gospel and telling people to repent and come to Christ. The so-called Church of the East thrived for over 1,000 years until the strict Islamic fundamentalism showed up. And in the 13th and 14th centuries, they started destroying churches and trying to eradicate Christianity. Well, a remnant of Christians is said to have survived all through all those centuries, and then the Taliban showed up with heavy weaponry from America back in the late 1970s, late 1980s. We showed you last week Hillary Clinton admitting that the U.S. government unleashed this, and as soon as they seized power, the remaining Christians were really, really targeted, and they did everything they could to destroy Christianity in Afghanistan. Even though there was this persecution, we still had an underground church in Afghanistan all throughout the Taliban. In fact, there was still a Christian church in Kabul all the way up until 2010. That's when the last Christian church in Kabul was demolished under the leadership of the Islamist Sharia-compliant puppet government put in place by the U.S. government, by the deep state. Believe it or not, it's true. And now, since the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan began in 2001, if it's possible to imagine, the situation for Christians in Afghanistan got even worse. Now, even regular Afghans who didn't necessarily have any particular hatred against Christians, now think of Christians as the people that are involved with those Americans who are coming to occupy their country and tell them how to do things. Nobody likes invaders in their country. And if you look at actually the things that the U.S. government did with their coalition partners in NATO and the UN, they imposed an Afghan constitution that actually established Islamic law as the only governing legal system in that country. Now, under Islamic law, of course, you will be executed for leaving Islam and converting to Christianity. And the Afghan government, put in place by the U.S. government, was ruthless. In fact, there was a TV clip of some Christians getting baptized in Afghanistan, and the CIA asset, U.S.-backed president of Afghanistan at the time, Hamid Karzai, vowed publicly he was going to hunt down those new Christians. They ended up arresting 20 people, according to the news reports. They prosecuted them, incidentally, with U.S. taxpayer money, and fortunately, people spoke out around the world. But people who converted to Christianity, people like Syed Musa, was imprisoned, was raped, was tortured, and was prosecuted for his faith under the puppet government put in place by the U.S. government, guys. And again, the last church in Afghanistan was knocked down not under the Taliban, but under the puppet government put in place by the United States, really by the deep state controlled foreign policy arm of the United States. Under the U.S. government-backed puppet regime in Afghanistan, remember, Sharia compliant, Afghanistan was considered #2 country in the world for persecution of Christians, right behind North Korea, which incidentally was also heavily subsidized by the U.S. government, by the deep state. And in fact, if you go back and look at the history, we did a whole cover story on this called North Korea, Globalist Pawn. What you'll find is that the deep state in the United States that handed China over to the communists also handed North Korea over to the communists on purpose, and then they built them up. The UN actually went in there and created factories so they could build microchips for their missiles. It's hard to believe, but it is true. Now, the Taliban, we talked about this last week. The Taliban, now that they've taken over in Afghanistan, they're very proud of the fact that their very close ally, in fact, their greatest ally, is the mass murdering dictatorship in communist China, also built up by the U.S. foreign policy establishment from the time that people like George Marshall, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, handed China over to the communists, up until today when the Fortune 500, the deep state, the Council on Foreign Relations continue to build up communist China. And they do have something in common with the Taliban, these butchers in Beijing, and that is they are mass murderers. They are ruthless persecutors of Christians, some of the most ruthless persecutors of Christians in the world. Okay. Now, do I mean to suggest that all the persecution of Christians in the world is related to the U.S. government or caused by the U.S. government? No, it's not. Right? That would be silly. Persecution of Christians has been going on for 2,000 years. Jesus even promised his followers that they would be persecuted if they followed him. As he said, the world's going to hate you. They hated me first, right? But it is a fact that the foreign policy of the United States, which quite ironically was founded and settled by Christians for the purpose of spreading the gospel and living out their faith, has now become the leading aid in the persecution of Christians around the world. And there are so many examples of this. We're going to do a very brief overview based on a cover story I did many years ago for the New American. It applies more today than ever. Pakistan, one of the top recipients of U.S. foreign aid, just so happens to also be one of the most ruthless persecutors of Christians in the world. And yes, that's government persecution. It's the government that will kill you for becoming a Christian. It's the government that will kill you if you supposedly insult the Prophet Muhammad. And yet the U.S. government continues shoveling billions of dollars at the government in Pakistan, continues providing all kinds of military assistance, even though, as we've documented very extensively in the New American magazine, the Pakistani ISI, their intelligence services, were literally working with the jihadists in Afghanistan who were killing American soldiers. If that all sounds crazy, it's not craziness, folks. It is deliberate. It is the policy of the deep state controlled U.S. foreign policy apparatus. Another one of the most brutal persecutors of Christians is the Islamist regime in Saudi Arabia. Hey, another leading ally of the U.S. government. Isn't that cute? All over the world, guys, U.S. taxpayers are being forced to subsidize the slaughter of Christians. They're being forced to give billions of dollars to regimes that slaughter Christians. And worse, they're actually helping to create the conditions that allow this persecution to happen in the first place. One of the really obvious places where this became impossible to ignore was Iraq, and we'll talk about this in just a moment. But one of the excuses that's being used now all over the world to persecute Christians by the persecutors is, hey, Christians are associated with America, and America is evil. America has been interfering in our country. America overthrew our government. America armed this or that terrorist group. We don't like America, and so therefore, since you're a Christian, we associate you with America, and we will kill you. Okay, all over the world, people say, hey, you've been backing dictators, you've been sparking revolutions, you've been imposing sanctions that have killed huge numbers of people. We don't want anything to do with you and your Christian America. Now, Iraq is an obvious example of this. First they told us we were going to go find weapons of mass destruction. Then it was the terror war, then regional security, all kinds of silly things that they've told us. But now it's, under the guise of spreading democracy was the most recent excuse they gave us. And think about this for a moment, guys. Democracy means majority rule or mob rule. Our founding fathers hated democracy. In fact, James Madison said it was one of the most dangerous and unstable forms of government. Go read Federalist number 10 about why he hated democracy. And yet, here we have the U.S. government squandering trillions of American dollars, thousands of American lives, to spread democracy. Well, what happens if you have a democracy in a nation where Muslims make up the overwhelming majority? Well, you get Sharia law, you get a death penalty for converting to Christianity. What business is it of the U.S. government to spread democracy to Muslim nations? What kind of crazy idea is that? And what we've seen is that when quote unquote democracy arrives, it does not bode well for Christians. So the chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Leonard Leo, he actually warned years ago that Christianity might be completely wiped out in Iraq and in Afghanistan, both nations that were under military occupation by the United States government. In other nations like Libya and Egypt, Pakistan, Syria, a similar fruit is being shown, and we'll go through some of that. Now, Christianity goes back almost 2,000 years in Iraq, guys. The Assyrian Christians are often said to be the natives, the indigenous people of that area. They survived through everything you can imagine. They survived the Persians, the Turks. They survived the Islamic invasions and attempted genocides over and over and over again, and yet they may not survive the Americans, believe it or not. Now, this was not true under the leadership of Saddam Hussein. Now, Saddam Hussein was a mass murdering dictator. He also was put in place with help from the U.S. government. True story. His weapons of mass destruction. Yeah, the U.S. government had the receipts, right? Look at this picture of Donald Rumsfeld with Saddam Hussein, right? Donald Rumsfeld was over there. Of course, he had weapons of mass destruction. They had the receipts, right? But under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, Christians were protected in Iraq from Islamist violence, from all kinds of violence. In fact, the Ba'ath Party was founded by an Orthodox Christian, and they believed that freedom of religion was one of the core tenets. Now, yes, the Iraqi dictator did persecute opponents, and yep, that's true. It is horrific, but Christians were able to worship openly. Christians were able to serve at the highest levels of government. In fact, there was a Catholic, Tariq Aziz, who served as the deputy prime minister and the foreign minister of Iraq. There's almost no Islamic nation where you have a situation like that. And it was not a surprise to the people who overthrew Iraq's government what was going to happen to the Christians. In fact, there was an advisor to President George W. Bush who was responsible for that. So even George W. Bush's advisors warned him about what was going to happen to the Christian communities there, and this was public knowledge. Okay, even before Americans invaded, political science expert Glenn Chansey, an Orthodox Church member, he wrote a piece explaining what was going to happen to Christians in the wake of the war. He said, and I'm quoting here, "This may come as a shock to many Americans whose image of Saddam has been framed by comparison to Adolf Hitler, but the prevalent fear among Assyrian Christians, both in Iraq and abroad, is that what comes next after an American invasion will be worse. Should the Assyrians be so concerned about being liberated by U.S. military power? If history is our guide, they shouldn't be afraid. They should be terrified." Okay. Now, Chansey didn't try to, conceal the evil nature of the Saddam regime, but he did say Saddam's regime permitted a degree of free practice for Christians that is positively enviable compared to the situations experienced in such U.S. allies as Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Christmas and Easter decorations always abound, even in Baghdad, and attending church does not require an act of courage. So after the U.S. invaded, though, everything changed. He says that the Assyrians have survived the coming of the Persians, the Arabs, and the Turks. Remains to be seen if they will survive the coming of the Americans. Unfortunately, he proved to be somewhat of a prophet on this issue. After Saddam fell, Islamist militias just absolutely blasted Christians. Christian businesses were seized. Churches were bombed. Women were raped. Daughters were kidnapped and sold into sex slavery. Muslim extremists, and even the so-called Kurdish allies, the communists up in the northern areas, all participated in the persecution of Christians. And if you look at the situation now, the Christian community in Iraq has been absolutely devastated. I mean, it's just absolutely appalling. So if you look at the numbers, when the U.S. government invaded Iraq, there was estimated to be about 1.5 million Christians. That was before 2003. By 2012, that number was estimated to be less than 500,000. Some estimates had it below 200,000, and even those were in hiding. Tragic beyond belief, but many of those Christians who fled from Iraq, and it was estimated that half of the refugees who fled from Iraq were Christians, many of them fled to Syria. Okay, Syria was another nation where Christians were protected, where religious freedom was upheld, where you could easily go to church in Damascus with no problem, where there were Christians serving at the highest levels of government. And what happened? Well, the Obama administration unleashed the jihadist terror hordes. They armed ISIS, and we've done whole episodes on that. We've got the smoking gun evidence. The U.S. government's Defense Intelligence Agency actually admitted in 2012 in a memo that Judicial Watch pried loose in 2016 that they supported the Syrian revolution, that the Syrian revolution was led by al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood, and that one of the goals was the creation of a Salafist principality in eastern Syria, what later came to be called ISIS or the Islamic State. So imagine that, folks. Imagine that you're a Christian in Iraq. The U.S. government invades, and you have to run for your life as your family is being slaughtered, as your churches are being bombed, and then you run to Syria. And then once you're in Syria, the U.S. government again steps in and gives weapons and air support and communications gear and diplomatic backing to Islamist terror groups that want to behead you and kill you. Imagine living through that, folks. Imagine living through that, and that is exactly what the U.S. foreign policy establishment did. A lot of the people in the region have been trying to speak out about this for well over a decade. The auxiliary Chaldean Bishop of Baghdad, he was pretty upset. He said, "Why did the Americans come? To do what? They came to give us freedom, the freedom to kill one another." Says everybody now hates the Christians. Yes, during Saddam Hussein, we were living in peace. Nobody attacked us. We had human rights. We had protection from the government. But now nobody protects us. He says since 2003, there's been no protection for Christians. We've lost many, many people. They've bombed our homes, our churches, our monasteries. Guys, remember, this was done with U.S. taxpayer dollars. And this is not a slight on the American people. The American people, yeah, they bear some of the responsibility because they allowed all this to be done in their name. They allowed all this to be done with their tax money. But the deep state, the Council on Foreign Relations, the people that control U.S. foreign policy have been at the cutting edge of this, and they deserve to be held accountable. It's so many atrocities. The constitution that the U.S. government imposed on Iraq, another disaster, says Islam is the official religion of the state. It's the fundamental source of legislation. No law that contradicts the established provisions of Islam may be established. And as you read this silly constitution, you see the CFR fingerprints all over, right? The government should control healthcare and education and employment and housing and virtually everything else, right? So we get rid of a socialist Saddam Hussein and we replace it with a socialist Islamist regime, right? Libya is another example of this, right? Christians were living peacefully in Libya under the leadership of the insane terrorist Muammar Gaddafi, and then the Obama administration comes in, they arm and they train the known al-Qaeda affiliate, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. They were bragging that they were al-Qaeda to the news, and what happened? Well, Christians were decimated, right? Under Gaddafi, there was more than 100,000 Christians living in Libya. The dictator was on very friendly terms with the Christians. In fact, the Coptic Christian leader gave Gaddafi an award in 2003. Muammar Gaddafi even used to give free buildings to Libyan Christians to use as churches. Now, this isn't to say that Gaddafi was a good guy. He was a terrible guy, but at least Christians could live and worship in peace. Then the U.S. government comes in. They arm al-Qaeda. They arm the jihadists. And what happens? Absolute disaster, right? Sylvester Magro, the Catholic Bishop of Benghazi, he was quoted telling Reuters that his flock normally was around 10,000 people. By the time the U.S. government was done working its magic there with its jihadist partners on the ground, it was reduced to a few hundred. Okay. Another Coptic priest said his congregation declined from more than 1,000 to about 40. We'll see if they return. Black Christians from sub-Saharan Africa who had been working in Libya under Gaddafi, they were virtually exterminated under the leadership of the forces backed by the Obama administration. Guys, just horrific. As Obama's rebels marched into Tripoli, they destroyed St. George's Church, the oldest Orthodox church in North Africa, going back to 1647. Just absolutely horrific. They kidnapped Christians. They went to desecrate the graves of the Italian and British soldiers that fought in Libya with sledgehammers. They knocked down all the crosses. Same thing in Egypt, right? Christians have lived in Egypt for 2,000 years under the leadership of Hosni Mubarak. They were free to worship. They were free to go to church. They were protected from Islamist violence. violence. Then Obama comes in, Arab Spring, change must take place. We need an orderly transition of power, and it's got to begin now. What happened? Right away, Christians are bombed, their churches are bombed, they're being kidnapped, they're being murdered, they're being massacred, they're being crucified. Unbelievable, guys. Everywhere the U.S. government goes, it seems they massacre Christians. We've actually got American diplomatic cables from WikiLeaks showing that the U.S. Embassy in Cairo was well aware that this regime change operation was being planned. In fact, they were even providing training and support for the leaders of this rebellion. Another Obama-backed military adventure. And when I say Obama, guys, realize Obama's not the puppet master here. Okay, Obama filled his cabinet with members of the Council on Foreign Relations. His Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, while she was serving as Secretary of State, said she gets her orders from the Council on Foreign Relations. Listen to this video real quick.
But it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
So there you go, folks. Now you know where Obama's key people were getting their instructions from, the Council on Foreign Relations. So Obama interviewed, very few people know about this, but in the nation of the Ivory Coast, there was a contested presidential election there. President Laurent Gbagbo had actually won the election. The Islamist globalist candidate challenged that, said there was fraud. Well, anyways, long story short, it went through all the Ivorian procedures. It went all the way up to the Ivorian Supreme Court. The Ivorian Supreme Court said Laurent Gbagbo, the Christian candidate, won the election fair and square. Enough of this madness. Well, Obama and the UN, they went in there and they backed the Islamic militias so that they could go wage war against this president. They slaughtered thousands of people. They took machetes. They locked Christians into churches and set the churches on fire. They hacked up thousands of Christians to death. They raped tens of thousands of Christians along the way. Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma said that this campaign was a reign of terror, and they finally managed to install their puppet Muslim central banker Alassane Ouattara as the leader, and he promptly proceeded to shut down all the opposition newspapers, jail all his political opponents, and launch more persecution of Christians. So, folks, if you think this is all a coincidence that everywhere the Council on Foreign Relations controlled U.S. foreign policy apparatus gets its claws, Christians are massacred, Christians are raped, Christians are exterminated, you are not clearly paying attention. This is by design, folks. This is by design. And now we're at the point where Christianity is on the verge of being eradicated in the land of its birth. It's been happening all over the place. These people were warned that this was going to happen. And there's a very real chance that that because of the actions of the U.S. government over the last few decades, Christianity may well be eradicated from the Middle East, from the cradle of Christianity. And we shouldn't be surprised, right? The deep state, the U.S. government is waging war on Christianity in America. They're using the court system to legalize the slaughter of babies. They're pushing the LGBT agenda down everybody's throats. They're persecuting Christians who don't want to shut down because of COVID mandates, right? Unbelievable, guys, what's going on, but this is by design. It is absolutely part of the deep state agenda, and it is our obligation as Americans, as voters, as citizens, to do what we can to stop it. I know we've gone on for a long time, but I wanted to share that with you guys. It's just, it breaks my heart, and I think people need to be held accountable for this. So I'm Alex Newman. This is Behind the Deep State. Thank you guys for watching, and until next week, God bless you all.
You know, it's no surprise that Facebook and YouTube and all the titans and tyrants of Silicon Valley, are the big tech companies, are censoring our content. We might not even be on these platforms for too much longer with the way things are going, folks. That's why it's all the more important that you head over to thenewamerican.com. You can sign up for our daily, weekly, or even monthly headlines. They'll get emailed directly to you. Better yet, you can subscribe to the New American Magazine. You'll get these delivered right to your door, and they can't censor a printed magazine. So get over to thenewamerican.com, sign up today, and stay informed in the fight for freedom.